Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, indeed all praise is due to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We praise Him and seek His help and forgiveness. We seek refuge in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from our evil intentions and our evil actions. He whom Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guides, no one can misguide, and he whom He leaves astray, no one can guide. Bismillah. Tonight, as Sheikh Hisham explained, I've been asked to have a brief discussion, begin a discussion, if we will, about the role of religious institutions in communities in the USA. But before that, I think we need to talk about, there's a big difference. This country is, for the most part, the majority of people who have a faith, claim that faith to be Christians. But there's going to be some history that goes back beyond this country in order for us to understand how the role between the polity and politics and religion works here in the U.S. and in the West and pretty much around the world. So Bismillah, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guide us in this discussion. We'll leave some time for questions toward the end. So the first thing that I'd like for us to discuss is this term religion, because words matter. And you all know that the first thing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created was the pen. And when He said pen, the pen began to write. That gives us an indication of the power of words, and whether the words are written or spoken, and the Quran being transmitted and being preserved through the spoken word. So words matter. One of the things that we have the word for Islam as a way of life is deen, and it gets mistranslated as religion. Religion and deen are two different things, and so we'll see that as we talk about and look at the history of how Islam is designed to operate and how these other faith systems work. There's a Center for the Understanding of Religion in American History, and they explain, quote, "This center explores the influence of religion on every facet of life in the United States. The root of the word religion means to bind or to be bound. Throughout American history, religion has bound us together," so they claim, and it also has been used to bind people in a negative way. Religion has kept people in bondage. And so it creates boundaries. It's not something that really frees you, contrary to some of the religious sayings that you shall know the truth and the truth shall make you free. Religion, the word religion does not mean that. The word deen means a way of life, which is, I don't say Islam is my religion. Islam is my deen, which is a better English translation. So there's an American myth that we need to talk about religion before we talk about how these institutions have changed over time. And the myth of American religion is summarized in an article from the Smithsonian Magazine that talks about, a lot of people think about religious freedom, religious freedom, religious freedom. When President Obama, when he was president, and they were building, there was a debate about a masjid being built too close to where the Twin Towers were. He came out with a very eloquent speech, and in his speech he talked about how this country was founded on religious freedoms and all these things we want to turn back to. Well, this whole thing about religious freedom in America is a myth. And I'll read you something about this from a quotation from an article in the Smithsonian Magazine, and it's titled, "America's True History of Religious Tolerance." Quote, "In the storybook version most of us learned in school, the Pilgrims came to America aboard the Mayflower in search of religious freedom in 1620. The problem is that this tidy narrative is an American myth. The real story of religion in America's past is often awkward, frequently embarrassing, and occasionally a bloody, violent tale that most civics books and most high school textbooks, either they paper over it or just push it to the side. So, from the earliest arrival of Europeans on America's shores, religion has often been a cudgel used to discriminate, suppress, and even kill the foreign and the heretic and the unbeliever, including the heathen natives, as they call them, that were already here. This whole kumbaya picturesque thing that they get from this celebration they call Thanksgiving is a myth. On that day, there was a lot of blood and a lot of violence, and a lot of indigenous Americans that were already here were killed. So moreover, while it is true that the vast majority of early generation Americans were Christian, the pitched battles between various Protestant sects, and more explosively between Protestants and Catholics, presents an unavoidable contradiction in the widely held notion of political tolerance in America. For example, in 1564, the French Huguenots, who were Catholics, there was some discord between them. There was some discord between the Spanish, who settled down in South America and in Florida. In 1565, when the Spanish set up St. Augustine, they wiped out a colony called Fort Caroline. The Spanish commander wrote to the Spanish King Philip II that he had, quote, hanged all those whom we had found in Fort Caroline because they were scattering the odious Lutheran doctrine in these provinces. And so we see, and that history goes on and on down until you get to the colonial times. And there's always been this religious division, and religion has not been as tolerant and as free as we think. The reason for that, because these were all some form of Christian religions, Catholic or either Protestant, they all fall under the Christian umbrella. And Christianity was never designed to connect you with God. For those of y'all that know anything about my background, I served as a Christian pastor in the Missionary Baptist Church for 15 years. And I was trained at the Pacific God Mission Men's Bible Institute, which is affiliated with Moody Bible College, which is one of the most prestigious Christian institutions in the world. And I'm not here to just beat up on Christianity. As the Quran teaches us that what they believe is for them, what we believe is for us, but we just have to speak the truth to know what we are dealing with and know how Islam differs so much, and don't allow ourselves to be put into the same categories that we just are another religion along with Christianity and other so-called religions. We're not. We're different. We're totally distinct. We're unique. The Quran tells us that Islam began as something strange. And we have to maintain that strangeness, the uniqueness of this deen. So the Christianity, as the history of it, has very little to do with Isa alayhi salam, or Christ. In the Christian Bible itself, there's nothing, did he ever start another movement. He was, even in the Christian Bible, in their own teachings, he was fully Jewish and taught Judaism, and said that he was sent to bring people back to the Old Testament of the teachings of Musa alayhi salam. So where did this thing that we all call Christianity emerge from? There was a Roman emperor, his name was Constantine. Constantine, the Roman Empire at that time had grown to be larger than it had ever been at any time. And it was very, very large. And so politically, there was a need to bind the people together, to keep them together in their allegiance to the emperor, to the state, to the polity. There were two main religions at that time in the Roman Empire: Mithraism, which was a bull cult. You could only be a member of that cult if you were a male. And there was also Christianity, which was emerging. This bull cult, there were some Roman emperors who were part of that cult. The Aurelian was one, and he instituted the cult of Sol Invictus, the invincible sun. They were sun worshipers. They believed that this bull named Mithra pulled the sun across the sky to keep it from colliding with Earth. And this is where we get, and so what happened with Constantine, he was making a political calculation. He needed to hold his empire together. His choices were the two predominant religions at that time was Mithraism, which only men, adult men, could be a part of that worship. And you had this emergent thing called Christianity, which had emerged out of Judaism, and Paul, which is really a Pauline Christianity that's based on the New Testament, where Paul, who calls himself an apostle, of some questionable background and reputation and character and history, does not line up. I encourage you all to get a book called The Myth Maker. And it talks about Paul, and it applies to some degree. Some of our science of Hadith is about looking at the transmittal of the historical record, objective historical record, that some of the things Paul said about himself just couldn't have been true, much less the things that that became Christian doctrine. So Constantine is the emperor. So he says, I need to hold my empire together. I got Mithraism, where I can only pull men together, or I've got this thing called Christianity that appeals to men, women, children, and families. So he made a calculated political decision. I can get more people, and more people committed and loyal to my empire, if I embrace this thing called Christianity. So what Constantine did, he made a political calculation, and he made Christianity the official religion of the state. That's why you became the Holy Roman Empire. It wasn't just the Roman Empire anymore. It became the Holy Roman Empire, and this is where we get the divine right of kings, and the Catholic Church emerged from that, and and then all the Protestant denominations that come from that. That's very significant, because what we see in that brief summary of the history as Christianity emerged is that the state, the government, the polity existed first, which was the Roman Empire. And then the Roman Empire created this thing called the Christian church. And the Christian church was designed to connect the people to the king, to the political power. It wasn't designed to connect you to God. And so you have the church, the state first, then you have the faith. In Islam, it's total opposite. The deen, the faith came first, then the caliphate. I think it was either this morning, yesterday morning, after Fajr, the brother gave a beautiful katara, and he was talking about the Meccan versus the Medinan surahs in the Quran. And the Meccan, how they differ in that they're talking about mainly belief, opposing the things of the Quraysh who oppose the revelation of the Quran from our beloved Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But in the Medinan period, you have other things about that interacting with one another and people and governing. But and so in Islam, the government or the caliphate is a tool of the deen. It's not greater than the deen. In Christianity, the religion is a tool of the state to connect you to the state. And this is why we get different roles and different things, and we'll see this legacy. And this is why the things that I read you earlier about intolerance, because the religion was not to connect you as brothers and sisters. It was to connect you to the state, to the government. And this is why some of the most bloodiest battles, with the Crusades and all these things were fought. And a lot of the times they were initiated and done in the name of Christianity. The same thing goes on now. America wants to civilize and democratize the world. It sets itself up as this great liberator of people who are in some ways that they feel are backwards. And that's part of the colonial and neo-colonial history. So Christianity blended together this Mithraism and this Christianity. And so it was designed to subjugate us to the government, to the state. And you can see that in certain passages of the Christian Bible. If we fast forward to the modern era, well, not into the modern era, if we look at this country, when my ancestors were brought here as slaves, one of the favorite Christian hymns is Amazing Grace, which according to history, one of the records was penned by a gentleman who was a slave runner and got this epiphany and thought the grace was amazing because of all the things he had done in slavery. But if you look at a map of the colonial period in the European powers as they began to colonize, one of the patterns was for them to set up missionaries, to go and establish missionaries, Christian missionaries in various countries in Africa and Asia and Latin America and South America. After the missionaries got there, then they had to send in some soldiers to protect them from the natives, as they call them. And then after they sent the soldiers there, the army, the battalions, to defend and protect the missionaries, then now they got all those people that they had to send in an administration to govern them all. And that's how they became colonized. Jomo Kenyatta, how many of y'all know who Jomo Kenyatta was? The country of Kenya, Jomo Kenyatta was a freedom fighter and for Kenya. And he said, one of his quotes, I'll paraphrase it, is that when the British came, they had the land. And the British gave them Bibles, and they took the Bibles in their hands and began to look at them. And when they looked up from the Bibles, all they had was a book, and the British had their land. There's an author, a Nigerian author named Chinua Achebe. He died a few years ago. He wrote a book called Things Fall Apart. If you have not read that book, I recommend you read it. It gives you a clear, it's a novel, but it's based on accurate historical records. It gives you a clear example that what the colonial powers would call backwards or heathens actually had very well-running systems that were not violent. And when the European settlers came in, that's when the violence came in. That's a very good book that gives you a look at pre-colonial life and then colonial life, and exactly what I just explained to you. The missionaries came first. Then after the missionaries, then the soldiers to protect the missionaries. Then after the soldiers to protect the missionaries, the administration. And that's the pattern throughout the so-called developing world or third world as the colonial powers came in. So when we see that, and the Bible was written, was the things that they voted to put into the Christian scriptures is designed to give you that subjugation. That's why you have certain verses in there that say that slaves obey your masters, because when you obey your masters, it's like obeying God. That was used to subjugate slaves everywhere in this country and other places. We have misogynistic statements that are in there that are to subjugate women to the rule of men. And then there's a very famous passage in Romans chapter 13 of the Christian Bible that say that you're supposed to obey the government, obey the governmental powers, because they are ordained by God. And so you can see this legacy of Constantine and the doctrine to really cause you to have your allegiance and to connect you with the state, not to connect you with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Almighty God. So what's the implication for this, the legacy that we see today? Well, what happened in the history of this religious intolerance, the baby boom generation, which I'm the last of that generation that was born from post-World War II to the early 60s, that generation began to get some understanding and some knowledge and some education, and to see and to learn some of the facts about Christianity and some of the atrocities that were committed in the name of democracy and the Christianity. And so what happened was there was a falling off, and there has been all the way up until now, where that the Christian institutions began to lose their reputation or their goodwill among a large amount of the public, and as people began to question the basis for what was being done and why it was done. And so this is what happened, and we're down to modern times. And so now you began to have a large number of people who are what they call seekers, They're seeking God in their own way. They're not affiliated with a religion or a church, a lot of Christians. And we see that trend beginning to infect and affect us here in the Muslim community. And what this does, and some of them are not atheists, you'll see things on social media posted talking about the universe. They've substituted God for the universe and other things, and crystals and this new age faith and all these other kind of things, because some people saw the myth of Christianity as being this great liberating influence, and saw it as not really connecting people to to God, but to the state, and began to question it. And also in the black community, we saw the black church that was at the vanguard of the civil rights movement in the 60s and all the way up into the mid 70s. But what happened was in the black community, the church began to lose its relevance to what was going on at the times. And younger generations and other people began to see that the church did not provide the support they needed for the day-to-day issues they were dealing with. And so they left these institutions and saw these institutions as not being relevant. They didn't give them guidance to navigate the vicissitudes of life. And what happened because a lot of times in the black community, people say, okay, well, the church, I need my utility bill paid, I got these criminal justice issues that are going on. We've got drugs in the community, we've got poverty still. And if the church's role had been so effective, why can't we do these things? So that's one thing about the institution, especially in the black community of the church. The second thing about the church as an institution, some of it was demographic as people aged. Some of it was that the church was the church's perception of the church as being socially relevant as an institution. And the third thing is the organizational evolution of the church in the United States. Max Weber is a sociologist, a German. His last name is spelled W-E-B-E-R. That's where the word bureaucracy comes from. Organizations, when they grow to a certain level, they are torn between doing two things: either perpetuating and preserving their own existence, or remaining relevant to meet the needs of the people that support them. And if organizations do not develop and evolve properly, they can morph into this deformed thing that is more concerned with its own interests and preserving its own existence than preserving and helping and assisting and meeting the needs of the people. So the organization becomes out of touch. It almost becomes like the government. It comes out of touch with the people. And people see this disjunction, and it loses its relevance. And so you end up with big, pretty buildings that are empty 6 days a week. And as a person who's been on the other Christian side for 15 years, as I told you, this is one of the dangers that I see with us as Muslims in America, that we are building a lot of masajids, a lot of buildings, and a lot of centers. But if we're not careful, the need to operate and just keep these entities in existence will cause us to drift away from being able to create spaces where we can give people the information and have the discussions about the things they need to deal with things going on in the world around them, especially the youth and the young people. They live in a different world than I grew up in. I was just thinking the other day, when I grew up, the TV would go off around 12 or 1 o'clock at night. There was nothing on to watch. All the radio stations had signed off. Most adults, young adults today, have never lived in a world like that. They live in a world where there's always something to sensitize them, always some image or something to occupy them or to hold their attention. So we have to make sure that we, as we develop here in the Muslim community, that we be intentional about making sure that we are relevant, that we have the space to discuss things and present things about how we are to develop so that we can maintain our uniqueness and maintain our relevance and not go the way of some other religious institutions have, where that their very worth and value has been questioned. And so now they have become just organizations that perpetuate their own existence rather than organizations, rather than organisms, because organizations don't have to be alive, but organisms are alive. We want to be an organism that is living and thriving and breathing life into the community and to the people we serve. And that's the challenge. And we have to understand the world, this country that we're in, the world we're in, so that we don't want the dunya to do dawa to us, where that we become a mirror image. And it's the same thing the Quran tells us. Look at the previous generations. And it's not just those, but we have to look at what's happened before us. There's a philosopher named George Santayana that says, one of his quotes is, those who forget the past are doomed to repeat it. And so we have to, one of the things that would be very useful for us to do was to look at what happened to some of these other institutions, faith institutions, and how can we maintain our social relevance without compromising our deen? Because this is what Islam is. The most segregated time in this country is on a Sunday morning. The most integrated time is on a Friday afternoon. And we need to point that out. It is. The most integrated time. Think about the next time we line up, when you come for Fajr in the morning, or the next time you come for Salam, when you come to Jummah this Friday, just take a moment to walk in and look around. And then any of you who have been to a church, most of the time, the churches are not as integrated on the whole. There's a reason for that. Because the history of the institution is different, and the purpose is different, and what comes first is different. And so, time won't allow us to go into all the details. I have a lot of material here. You can see me afterwards. I'll be happy to share it with you. But the reason that Sheikh Hisham and some of the other the imams and some other people are not in here is because the education committee is meeting. And that's what they're meeting on, is for us to take things like this discussion and this presentation, and integrate it into what we do for education so that we can understand the history of this country, the history of this world, the history of Islam, and how our histories differ, and how we have to maintain that difference if we are going to continue to be a force for positive change in the world. So I'm going to have some time now for some open discussion and questions. That's all the presentation for now. But if you all have some questions, or we can take them now, inshallah. None? So did you all know this about the Constantine and the history of the Christian church? Was something you all were aware of? No? Yes? Sleep? Yeah. But this is, I was talking to another brother the other day, and he was saying this is a point that hadn't been brought out, that ours is different, that the caliphate, the deen, to connect you to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the purpose, we go back to the purpose, the oneness of Allah, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the Quran, what might be translated as, I created the mankind and the jinn to worship me. And this is the caliphate comes first, and then the state. So I hope that this has been enlightening for us, and to help us to think about our deen and our role, and how we can help maintain our uniqueness and not be thrown into the same cauldron, if you will, of these other faiths, because we operate differently. Our history is different. Our purpose is different. Yes? Well, very good point. And the question was that they're integrated, and we can't say that one came first and one came second. But when you look at a historical comparison, the point I'm making is that the purpose and what it was used for, Islam is designed to connect us to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? That's what it's designed to do. So the state, the caliphate, we didn't have any caliphs until the deen was established. Is that correct? Right. That's my point. On the other side, there is no separation of church and state. That's a myth. That was one of my points. That the church emerged in the history of the West from the Roman Empire as a tool of the state. And so the government and so again, the whole idea is what the purpose of Islam is, to connect us with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And you're right. And the reason you're saying that we're in agreement, because the way they're blended is because the purpose is driven to connect you with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The Christian on the Christian side, that we have to make that distinction, because Christianity historically was not designed to connect you with God. It was designed to, if I were a white man during the slavery times or during the colonial period, my purpose in my religion was to convince me that I'm superior to you and to convince you that you're inferior to me and you should like it. Now we don't have that history in Islam where that the Quran that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam taught us, or the Quran has been rewritten and reinterpreted for that purpose. And this is the difference. And what we want to do is we want to guard against being infected, so that we begin to see that and begin to see ourselves as just another faith like these other faiths. So this is why I make the distinction between that, because that was Islam did not spread the same way Christianity did. There was no colonialism. Islam spread mainly by merchants and by people going into communities, integrating into communities. And I have some of the research I've done has said that when people became anti-Islamic in some communities, people would say, no, you can't treat these people this way because they are a positive part of our community. So the dawah was in the way we lived as Muslims. And most of the times in the crusade, Islam was not spread by the sword. That's another myth. That Islam spread by us going and invading people and telling them if they didn't take the Shahada, we would cut their heads off. The fighting that we did was in defense against the Crusaders, who were going back in the name of their church to try to conquer Jerusalem and take over some relics and some other things. But I understand your point. But the purpose of these faiths is where we have to draw the distinction. Standing alone, no. But when you compare the political history and the history of these institutions in communities throughout time, that's where we draw the distinction. And we ask the question, why? Why is one having a different effect than another? It's because Christianity is doing what it's designed to do, to make you pay homage to the state, and first and foremost. And Islam is doing what it's designed to do, to connect you to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. For the most part, neither one is perfect, because imperfect people do some imperfect things with them. But that's the purpose. There's nowhere in the evolution and the evolution and the progress of Christianity where it was designed to connect you with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The whole thing is man-centered. And that's a whole nother subject. But if you center around it, because it centers around people. If you go and you read the Christian Bible, the stories about the humans in that Bible overshadow the role of God. In the Quran, it's different. The Quran is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala giving revelation to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam to deal with people. And the first to connect with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then to deal with people. And so when you compare these two, you can make more sense out of what you see going on around you, and the trap that we want to avoid as Muslims, that our deen and the way we practice this deen does not fall into that same trap. We don't want to be sitting here 60 years from now with people wondering why Islam lost its relevance to what's going on in the lives of people. And that's what's happened a lot of times with Christianity, especially in the black community. There's a lot of people are very disaffected because they don't see it. I talk to people all the time, and one of the challenges is why they can't get people committed to come to the churches is because a lot of the young people, young adults, don't see where it's relevant to what they're dealing with. We face with a similar challenge, and the thing to do is to learn what not to do. And what not to do is not just today. We got to go all the way back to the history and to the roots of where we are today to understand how we have to remain true to that purpose, to connect people with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala first and foremost. We don't want to connect you to programs. We don't want to connect you to events. We don't want to connect you to activities. We don't want to connect you to leaders and leadership. We want to connect you to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now we can use those things as tools to do that, but we must not let the tail wag the dog or put the cart before the horse, whether we want to just perpetuate the existence. You know, we don't come to IAR to just maintain the building and maintain the programs. We come to IAR to increase our iman and increase our taqwa. And this is the difference. And if we don't keep that first and foremost, we run the very high risk of doing some of the same things these other faiths have done. So Jazakallah khair, that's the time that we have. If there are no other questions or comments, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Anybody else? Yes, sir. The early Christians did what now? The early Christians were referred to as agnostics and persecuted when the Trinity came in. Is that true? Well, the Constantine, they blended in a lot of other beliefs, because remember again that these guys, these Roman emperors and Constantine and some of the ones before him and even some after, their goal was to use the faith as a tool to hold the empire together. So whatever they saw as a threat to the empire, they might have done that. I know Diocletian persecuted and killed some Christians, but Constantine was a little bit more pragmatic. And the Trinity and all of those other things did not come, those were Pauline doctrines. The early Christians didn't see themselves as Christians. The whole term Christian and other things are things that came decades after Isa, the time of Isa on earth. And these were none of the people that wrote anything about Isa ever met him or directly had contact with him. Most of the New Testament is written by Paul, who's a person of, I don't know if you were in here, there's a book called The Myth Maker that looks at the life of Paul. Paul claims that he was taught by this Hebrew scholar, Gamaliel, which can't be true because Paul would have been a boy, a child. And the Gamaliel, the rabbinical scholars didn't teach children. They taught adults or young adults. And so a lot of these things just don't add up. So, but the Christian, a lot of things, to answer your question, have been done in the name of the church, but it's to perpetuate the state, and it's to keep the state going and to keep because that's what Constantine, the Christianity that we know it of today, to what we call from the time of Constantine, where all of this developed from, That what the purpose was for. Constantine still personally worshiped the sun. And a lot of the Christian rituals are still rooted in Mithraism. That's why they worship on Sunday. You know, because Mithraism was related to sun worship, which goes farther back to Zoroastrianism and the fire gods and all these kind of things. And so this is where this is all rooted at. There's a similar, as I'm sitting here thinking, you had, you know, when the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam came, got the revelation of Wali, people were in Mecca worshiping, but they had all these idols, you know, from the time of Nuh alayhi salam. And so the same Christianity, not that what happened was it's a blend. It's kind of like the way the Quraysh were when the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam came along. It's a blending of all these other different pagan and polytheistic beliefs. So a lot of things may have been done in the name of it. It depended on the political climate. And this is back to my earlier point. It has less to do with your eternal home, the Akira, than it does maintaining and perpetuating power in the dunya. So it depends on I mean, even in the history of this country, when John F. Kennedy was running for president, there was a big division over whether people should vote for him because he was a Catholic. And so was he going to be obeying the Pope, or was he going to be obedient to the Constitution? So these kind of religious, and we see it now even with the evangelical movement and a whole lot of other things. And this is why people don't understand how the evangelicals can be supporting a person like Trump. But it's easy. It's the same thing that Constantine did. The Roman patricians, elites, were some of the most hedonistic people ever lived. But the religion was designed to connect you to them, not to God. So, yeah. So I mean, it's when you know the history, it's not as odd as it may on the surface seem. Anyone else? Okay, our time is up.